Hey guys, how's it going, and welcome back to another episode. In today's episode, we're going to talk about 10 things that you did not know about Mexico. Now, I know most of you guys out there that have watched my videos before, you know that on this channel, I like to talk about topics and things about life out here in Mexico that most people, they don't even want to touch with a 10-foot pole. So this list that I have compiled, well, it's no different. I'm going to be talking about things that you probably didn't know about living in Mexico. In fact, most people don't even know about Mexico until they actually come out here and they see it for themselves. The first thing that you're probably going to notice as soon as you get to Mexico is how this country looks like Europe. It feels like Europe, it looks like Europe, but it's definitely not Europe. It's in the Americas. It's American. But obviously, it's not the United States of America or Canada, but it's definitely America. We are in the Americas after all. But why is it that the USA and Canada are basically almost the same? You know, they look alike, feel alike, they almost talk alike, eh? Bruh. But the reality is that, you know, they're very different. They're two different countries. But why is it that when you go south, when you go across the border into Mexico, why is it that Mexico is so completely different than the actual USA or Canada? Why is it that Mexico resembles, you know, the rest of Latin America a lot more than it actually resembles the USA? Why is it that the architecture is different and so many things are different out here? Well, for, you know, a quick little history lesson, back in the day, you know, when the English first came out here looking for religious freedom, you know, they landed on Plymouth Rock and, you know, all that stuff. And they started the 13 colonies. And before you knew it, the 13 colonies revolted. They started a new country and a new way of life. All right. And so that's the story of the USA in 2 seconds. And so, you know, that's the shortest version of the story of the USA you're going to find out here. But when it came to Mexico, Mexico was completely different. Mexico was conquered by the Spanish. When the Spanish came out here to the Americas, well, they came with conquistadors, aka conquerors, okay? And so they came out here with their religion, all right, their Christianity, their Catholicism, and they basically took over the Americas. Now, they really didn't necessarily take over the Americas. If you look at, you know, all of the Americas, you're going to see there's a lot of indigenous people still living here, a lot of indigenous culture still living here, and that's, you know, a whole, you know, thing on its own there, as opposed to what you're going to see in the USA and Canada when it comes to that. But with that said, there were many reasons why they couldn't conquer all of the people in the Americas, why they couldn't conquer all of the people in Mexico. In fact, the name Mexico, Mexica, I know I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there, but that is what the indigenous people here before the Spanish came along, that's what they used to call this area, Mexica. But again, roughly translated to today, it's Mexico. And so when the Spanish came, they conquered, you know, they would tear down a bunch of the pyramids and temples that the people that lived here had, and they would build large cathedrals on top of those areas. So that's why you see all these large cathedrals everywhere. This is why you see a lot of European architecture, you know, whether it's the cobblestone roads or the cathedrals or the buildings, everything from the governor's palace to other important buildings, you know, throughout all the cities, throughout all of Mexico. So again, you know, there's a large influence when it comes to the architecture, not just the roads and the buildings and, you know, so many other things there. But on top of that, they brought along their culture, you know, meaning that, you know, the people out here, they live a lot more like Europeans. For a lot of Americans that move out to Mexico, you know, one of the complaints that they have is how things move out here. You know, they move slower. The people out here have different priorities. It's all about living life and so on and so forth. And if you've ever been to Europe or you know any Europeans, well, you know that that's how they live their life as well. They have just a completely different view of the world and how life should be lived. And so that's why, you know, when a European comes out here for the most part to Mexico, well, there's a lot of similarities to their own culture and how they live their life. But when an American or Canadian comes over here, well, they have a lot of trouble assimilating to the culture just simply because, well, the culture itself is a lot more closely related to the way that people live out there in Europe. Now, it's not to say that Mexico isn't closely related to the USA. Again, we've talked about it multiple times on the channel as to how Mexico loves American culture. Just like in the USA, we love Mexican culture and we love eating Mexican food. Well, guess what? In Mexico, they love to eat hamburgers and hot dogs and pizza and all kinds of American food. They love American culture. They love American music. They listen to rock and roll music still. They love American cinema. They love a lot of things about American culture, the USA culture from the United States of America. Now, again, we all know as Americans that the culture from the USA is spread around the world. Many countries around the world love their iPhones and their blue jeans and their Big Macs and their Coca-Cola. Well, Mexico is no different, especially being its neighbor, its southern neighbor. Let's not forget that Mexico and the USA share one of the biggest borders in the world. And so obviously there's a lot of influence when it comes to the culture for many reasons. So for me personally, living out here in Mexico, it always feels like if the USA and Europe had a baby, it would be Mexico. Again, it's not to say that Mexico doesn't have its own culture. Mexican culture is very strong, one of the most influential cultures out there in the world. It has amazing food, amazing art, just, a lot of culture that they themselves export around the world. And a lot of people love things about Mexico. It is its own country. It has one of the largest populations in the world. In fact, the 11th most populous country in the world. It is also one of the richest countries in the world at the moment, and so on and so forth. So, Mexico is growing and it's becoming very, very modern, but at the same time, it has a lot of the old school, old world style of living, architecture, customs, and so on and so forth. And so because of that, I always like to joke around and say how Mexico is half European and half American. And again, if you just look at the history, well, that's exactly what it is. The Spanish came out here and had a humongous influence on Mexico and the Americas, and the American culture that existed here, meaning the indigenous people that lived here, well, they also have not gone anywhere. And because of that, it has been a very unique and amazing fusion that has happened in this country. Because, for example, in the USA and in Canada, they got rid of most of the indigenous people and their culture. But in Mexico, they really couldn't get rid of it. It's everywhere. Whether you're down in the south and you got the Mayan culture, or you got, the Nahuatl, culture, or whatever other indigenous culture you have that's still here alive and well. In fact, they speak, I think, like 69 different languages in this country. There's no official language, from my understanding, in Mexico. And of course, out there in the audience, you would think it would be Spanish. But the reality is that there has been a giant fusion of cultures in this country that most people are just not aware of. And so that's why, again, it has a lot of heavy influences from Europe, but it's not Europe. And it has a lot of heavy influences from the United States and from the Americas, just the American people that were here, before anyone came out here. And because of that, that is why, Mexico is its own very unique culture and country compared to the other countries around the world. It is a real fusion of cultures that is still alive and well, and it's just going to continue growing and growing as the years go on. Another thing about Mexico that makes it extremely unique and a lot of people just don't know about is that it is extremely biodiverse ecosystem. It has all kinds of unique animals that you're just not going to find in other parts of the world. You got bears in the north and spider monkeys in the south. You got areas where you can go watch whales, and you can see sea lions, and you can see tigers and pumas and panthers. Oh my. There's all kinds of biodiversity when it comes to, life out here in Mexico. On top of that, the ecosystem is extremely unique. Where I live out here in the Yucatan, I basically live in low-lying jungles, all right, which comes with its, unique set of animals and plants and weather and so on and so forth. In a place like Guadalajara, Mexico City, and other areas that are up in the mountains, well, they got their own ecosystem up here and their own weather patterns. But with that said, there's a lot of misconceptions as to what Mexico really is like. A lot of people out there, when they hear Mexico, the first thing that comes to mind is desert. That's it. It's just a bunch of desert or a bunch of beautiful beaches. Now, it's not to say that Mexico doesn't have desert and beautiful beaches. It has those, but on top of that, it has jungle, it has mountains, it has plateaus, it has steppes, it has all kinds of different ecosystems and biodiversity out here in this country that you will never in a million years even know about until you actually come out here. Again, when you're traveling through Mexico, you're going to see areas that look just like Europe. There are going to be areas, where they're going to have, beautiful waterfalls. They're going to have underground watering holes. Some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. Beautiful sand dunes in the desert. There's snow in Mexico. I myself didn't even know when I first moved to Mexico that it even snowed out here. I had no clue. I had no idea that Mexico was so mountainous. And because of its geography, is another one of the main reasons why when the Spanish came out here, they could not completely conquer the indigenous people out here. And they were forced to, have a marriage, a fusion of cultures and mix everything together to make something extremely unique, which is Mexico. So I think for a lot of people out there in the audience that have never visited Mexico or have only visited a few areas of Mexico, they will be pleasantly surprised to see how diverse Mexico actually is in many areas, not just biodiversity and not just an amazing ecosystem. It's so much more, which we're going to talk about more as this video goes on. Now, another thing a lot of people just have no clue about when it comes to Mexico is Cinco de Mayo. Bruh. Cinco de Mayo, how I like to say. In the USA, everybody celebrates Cinco de Mayo. And I'm not talking about Mexicans, I'm just talking about everybody in the USA celebrates Cinco de Mayo. The reality is that if you come to Mexico, you're going to quickly see, as soon as you step out of certain areas like Cancun or Tijuana, that nobody celebrates Cinco de Mayo. In fact, Cinco de Mayo was just a war between Mexico and the French, which again has its own story. But long story short, many moons ago, on Cinco de Mayo, Mexico was able to defeat the French as they were taking over Mexico. And so the fact that Americans in the USA celebrate Cinco de Mayo, and for whatever reason they celebrate it as if it's Mexican Independence Day or whatever it is, well, the funny thing is that Cinco de Mayo out here in Mexico is just Cinco de Mayo. It's just another day. It's not even a holiday. Most people don't even recognize it as a day. The only reason they even know about Cinco de Mayo is because of the gringos that come out here and they want to celebrate Cinco de Mayo. And most Mexicans are like, well, why do you want to celebrate that day? It has nothing to do with Mexican history. Yeah, things happen on that day. Again, it was something between the French and Mexico there, which again, maybe you guys down there in the comments can be more specific as to what exactly happened during that time. But at the end of the day, it's not what you think. In fact, Mexican Independence Day is September 16th. And the way they celebrate out here is that they actually celebrate it on the 15th and then the 16th. So how they celebrate Mexican Independence Day is that on the 15th, they start celebrating, and the celebration goes on through the night. So how they celebrate it is basically on the 15th is that they kind of treat that as a half day from work. Again, depending on when the 15th falls. But let's just say the 15th falls on a Wednesday. Well, it's kind of like a half day of work, and then once that work day is over, they start celebrating, and they celebrate really hard. Okay, and they, again, if you know anything about Mexicans and Mexican parties and how they like to get down, they like to get down. All right, so with that said, they start celebrating on the 15th, and they take it all the way until midnight. Once midnight rolls around, the Mexican president does this thing called El Grito. It's not just the Mexican president, but the mayor of cities or the governor of the state, in which you're going to be located in Mexico. But anyways, all the governors, all the mayors, the president of Mexico, all these people, they basically step out onto the balcony from the presidential palace, and they do El Grito, which is the scream. And what that represents is that back when Mexico became an independent country, back when they fought their own version of the Revolutionary War that created the country of Mexico, Well, they came out on their own balcony and they screamed victory. Mexico is free. And so that has been a tradition that has been passed down all the way through current times. And so right now they still celebrate it that way. So at midnight, once the president, the governor, all these people, they go out there and they scream for victory, Independence Day, all that good stuff. That's when the party really begins. And so they continue that party all the way through the next day. And the real Independence Day is on the 16th. But celebration starts on September 15th, rolls into the 16th, and September 16th out here is basically like Christmas Day, Christmas morning, meaning it is a very, very important federal holiday. So therefore, basically everything's closed and you gotta, plan accordingly. But again, if you're gonna be living out here in Mexico, then you should be living like the Mexicans. So you should be celebrating with the Mexicans. So just to come full circle, nobody celebrates Cinco de Mayo out here in Mexico. They celebrate the 15th, 16th of September. Another cool thing about living out here in Mexico that I learned, by being out here, which I had no idea, was the fact that Mexicans not only love American culture, but they love Asian culture. They really, 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 really love Asian culture. In fact, I was extremely surprised by how much they loved Asian culture. In fact, some can even argue that they love Asian culture even more than Asians. And what do I mean? Specifically, Japanese culture, Korean culture. Now, again, there's a lot of Asian influence out here in Mexico that a lot of people don't know about, but there was a lot of Chinese immigrants, a lot of Korean immigrants, throughout the generations, a lot of Japanese that have come out here, and so on and so forth. All right, but for the purposes of what I'm talking about here, as of right now, the main influence that is still here is a lot of Japanese and Korean influence. And so out here in Mexico, a lot of the Mexicans, a lot of the locals, out here, especially the younger generations, they love all those things that come from over there. Things like anime, the magna, they love to dress up and cosplay. Again, out here they have tons of anime conventions and Japanese, Korean, Asian themed conventions. Again, when I first came out here, obviously I know that culture has spread throughout the world, and a lot of people love that Asian culture, but I had no idea. I was not prepared to see how much they actually loved it out here. And so, as the years have gone on since I've been living here, I've inquired as to why there's so much Asian influence out here. And so, long story short, a lot of the younger generation, like my wife or someone my age that was born and raised out here in Mexico, well, their version of Saturday morning cartoons was Asian anime. Okay, so from a very, very, very young age, they were all introduced to anime, in many forms, okay? Because as an American, we just started to get into anime fairly recently compared to Mexico or other Latin American countries. But the reality is that, out here, a lot of the, cartoons, again, the anime, the manga, the comic books, just so much of that culture was exported to other countries. And one of the main importers of all that was Mexico. So obviously, after many decades of influence, well, come today, you're going to see so many young people and even older people. Again, I'm in my early 40s, but I know plenty of people out there that are my age or even older that are super hardcore into all this stuff. They love watching Korean movies and Korean TV shows and soap operas, and I can go on and on. They love their Pokemon. They love their Asian food. There's some places in Mexico where there's a lot of Chinese influence, a lot of Chinese food. There are Chinatowns in certain areas of Mexico, certain cities, like in Mexico City, Tijuana, and I can go on and on. So whether it's China, Korea, Philippines, Japan, and I could go on and on. It's an extensive list of Asian countries that have their influence out here in Mexico. But the reality is that it is pretty incredible to see, because I myself, as an American, I've lived in areas such as Seattle, where there is a very, very heavy Asian influence and population, and yet I feel like Mexico has even more influence. They have a lot more love and appreciation for Asian culture as a whole. So that was a pretty interesting and cool surprise. But long story short, there's a giant influence with Asia out here in Mexico. Another interesting thing about living out here in Mexico that I was extremely surprised of was the fact that there's a lot of gringos out here. Not just gringos, but there's a lot of people that call themselves expats that live out here. Now, I know this is a topic all on its own here, but when I first moved here, the whole term of expat was something that I would only hear once in a blue moon. Before I ever came out here to Mexico to live out here in Mexico, whenever I would hear that term expat, it was just, some guy that fought in the Vietnam War, and he went out there to go live in Cambodia, with his Cambodian girlfriend or whatever it is, okay? And so, that whole term expat, really meant expatriate, and it was just certain people out there that fit a certain description of a certain American that was a hardcore American, and they felt pressured or they had to leave the USA for whatever reason. And there was this term that used to be called go bamboo. So a lot of these people would just go bamboo and they would just disappear into the bush. So when I first moved to Mexico, the last thing I was expecting was to hear that term expat. I was definitely expecting to hear gringo. Obviously, there's a lot of gringos, especially in the areas of like Tijuana, the Baja California area. There's a lot of gringos, that basically, go down into that area all the time, live out there. There's a lot of gringos that are basically Mexican. I'm sure you know who they are. And they all live on the border areas, so there's a lot of people in Texas that love Mexican culture, and they're basically honorary Mexicans. And so same thing with Baja, just think about how many people that come from Los Angeles or from San Diego or from those regions, and then eventually they made their way into Tijuana. They kept going south, and before they knew it, well, they were living in Mexico full time. And so these gringos that lived out there, or the gringos that would come visit places like Acapulco or Cancun or whatever it is. And so basically it was just gringos, and that's it. But when I came out here, all of a sudden that term expat, well, I started to hear it all over the place. In fact, I myself, when I first moved out here, I called myself an expat only because I was, again, using the old description, the old terminology for expat. Again, I left my country of the USA very disillusioned, and I still believed in what the founding fathers of the USA stood for, freedom and liberty and all that stuff. And so obviously I couldn't find it in the USA anymore. I didn't recognize the country that I was born and raised in anymore. So when I came out here to Mexico, all of a sudden I felt at home, just like a lot of these ex-soldiers used to feel when they did, their transition. And so therefore, I came out here and I called myself an expat because that's what I consider myself. I wasn't a gringo because I'm Cuban, and I spoke Spanish, and I was a lot more familiar with the culture and so on and so forth. So, I wasn't a gringo. In fact, I identified more with a Mexican than a white American from, middle America. Again, coming from Miami, Florida, both my parents were Cuban immigrants. So to me, when I lived in Seattle, that was a lot more of a culture shock for me than moving to Mexico. Moving to Mexico was a lot easier for me, to assimilate to. And so obviously I wasn't a gringo. So I called myself an expat. But then as I was living out here and I started to see these expat communities, and I started to see all these Americans that lived out here, and they would call themselves expats, and they were anything but expats, because to me, an expat is just basically somebody that left the USA and they do not plan on returning at all. Period. End of story. So when I would see these people that would call themselves expats, but they would nonchalantly, go back to the USA all the time. They wouldn't live here full time. They got their lives here, they got their lives over there. Or again, even if they're living out here in Mexico full time, they're still involved very heavily in the democratic process of living in the USA. And they would, they still vote, they still get heavily involved in politics, they still get heavily involved in the matters of the USA while they're living in Mexico. To me, I was like, well, you guys are gringos. You guys aren't really expats. Expats to me are people that just basically wrote off the USA as, that's it, we're done. I'm not going back. I'm breaking up with you. We're done here. So all of a sudden, I started seeing all these people that call themselves expats. And as I started to get to know a lot of these people, again, this is not everybody. All right, I'm speaking in generalization here, and I'm speaking in broad terms here. But anyways, it was a lot of people that basically, they had this sense of entitlement, and they came out here and they did not want to be called gringos, and they definitely did not want to assimilate to Mexican culture the way they should be assimilating. And so therefore they would call themselves expats just because, well, they are an actual immigrant. They are a foreigner in this country, but they did not want to be called an immigrant or even be considered an immigrant or a foreigner. And so therefore they came up with this term expat. And so they just basically bastardized, they basically hijacked that term and they converted it into something else. Nowadays, whenever you say that term expat, well, it definitely makes a lot of people's hair stand up, okay? And not necessarily in a good fashion or a good way. So when I'm with other Americans and they call themselves expats, okay, in that small little group of individuals, we might call ourselves expats because, again, that term gringo doesn't really, represent me, and it might not represent a lot of the people, that I know that are American that live out here. So we just call each other expats. But there's a lot of people out there that are basically calling themselves expats all the time. So when they're dealing with other Mexicans, they're dealing on a day-to-day basis, with Mexican people, Mexican culture, Mexican everything, and they tell these Mexicans that they're not immigrants or foreigners. No, they are expats. Or they talk to themselves in the third person and describe themselves to these Mexicans as expats, hey, I'm an expat. I'm not an immigrant or a foreigner. Well, obviously, with all the problems that Mexico's having, with its gentrification and the growth and all that stuff. Again, I've talked about this more in depth in other videos, so you can watch those at the end of this video. I'm going to provide the links at the end of this one. But long story short, the term expat these days is not necessarily a good word. In fact, if you talk to a Mexican and you mention that word expat, you can already see their eyes rolling so back far into their head that they might get stuck there. Okay, so to me, I really don't use that term expat unless I'm talking to another American friend of mine and it just happens to come up in conversation. We're trying to describe, ourselves or someone else, whatever, and we just have to use that term expat because that's the only thing that's like kind of fitting there. That's the only time that I ever use that term anymore, period, end of story. Because when I'm out and about and I'm just dealing with Mexicans, I'm with my wife, I'm with my wife's family or friends or whatever it is, and all of a sudden that term comes up, it is just pure cringe. Just cringe to the max. So I really, really avoid using that term as much as possible. So the term expat has really gotten a negative connotation out here, especially in recent years. And so because of that, well, it's not something that you want to use. Because again, whenever a Mexican hears that term expat, the first thing that comes to mind is entitled American.
How dare you?
When they hear gringo, whatever. He's just a gringo. It's more of a cutesy name for an American. Okay? But whenever the term expat is used, it's not cute at all by any stretch of the imagination. So just be warned out there, okay, that if you're going to be using that term expat, probably keep it amongst yourselves, okay? Don't be going out there talking to Mexicans and telling them that you're an expat, because right off the bat, as soon as you say that, the prices on whatever they're selling you are going to go up.
Bruh.
And they may not be as patient or as nice as you might be expecting. So again, a little word of advice. If I were you and you're moving to Mexico and you are an immigrant, okay, you are a foreigner, please call yourself that, all right? And make sure that they know that that is what you are. And I'm telling you, everything will be just fine and hunky-dory, all right? Because they're going to know immediately that you have humbled yourself to the point where you're calling yourself what you are, an immigrant, a foreigner. Another interesting thing that I've found about living out here in Mexico is that not all Mexicans are brown.
Huh?
Okay? It's as simple as that, okay? There are plenty of Mexicans out here in Mexico that are white as snow, okay? They're blonde, green eyes, blue eyes, the whole shebang, over 6 foot tall. There are Mexicans, okay, that basically look European. In fact, they look like the great-grandchild of the Spanish conquistador that came out here originally, okay? So there are plenty of Mexicans that are white, blonde, blue eyes, tall, basically European looking or American looking, okay? From, USA, Canada, all right? So just be aware of that, okay? So depending on the city you move into and depending on how you look will depend on whether they're going to speak Spanish to you right off the bat or not. Not only are there a lot of white Mexicans, there's a lot of black Mexicans as well, okay? So there's a big mix, okay? So it's not just white, blonde, blue eyes, but there's also blacker than black, Mexicans out there in areas like Veracruz, Oaxaca, and so on and so forth. There are huge communities and huge areas of black Mexicans that I was not aware of at all. I mean, I myself, again, being Cuban, there's a lot of black Cubans, there's a lot of mixture. We got the mulattoes and all that stuff. And so to me, obviously, I don't know why it was such a surprise to me when I first encountered this, but it is pretty trippy to see, very, very black Mexicans and they're speaking in Mexican. They don't speak any other language and they're, eating their tacos, making their tortillas. They're Mexican, but they're also black as F, okay? So there's a lot of white Mexicans, there's a lot of black Mexicans, but there's also a lot of brown Mexicans, which is the Mexicans that most people know out there. But on top of that, there's also a lot of Asian Mexicans. And there's also a lot of Mexicans that have a lot of lineage or heritage or whatever from the Middle East. So there's a lot of Middle Eastern Mexicans out here as well. I mean, for example, when you look at a place like Sanborns or Chedraui, or, there's a bunch of other companies out there that kind of don't make sense. It's like, man, where did that name come from? It's not Spanish and it's not, native. So where is that from? Well, it's because it probably came from Lebanon, or something like that. So there's a huge influence, okay, out here from the Middle East, that goes back, again, decades. On top of that, there's a huge Asian influence as well. And I'm not just talking about the Asian influence that I just mentioned a little earlier, when it comes to anime and things like that. No. Again, look, my wife herself, okay? Her great-grandparents, okay, they were Korean, they were Chinese. She has a lot of Asian influence in her family tree. But she also has a lot of Mayan influence, a lot of Spanish influence. So in her own family, there are people that look Asian. There are people that look white like me. There are people that are Mayan. There are short, tall. There's all kinds of people. She's really, a complete mix of a lot of the cultures that are out here in Mexico. And she is no different than many other Mexicans that also share a very similar background. And those are completely different. But yet there are plenty of people out here that have mixed with all of them or haven't mixed with any of them. All right. So that's another really interesting surprise when I first moved out here to Mexico, that I saw, how there are many, many Mexicans that don't look Mexican at all until they start talking to you. And when they start talking to you, you're pleasantly surprised that, oh, wow, they're Mexican. That's pretty crazy. That's pretty cool. Another thing about Mexico that a lot of people might not know out there is the fact that there's a lot of Mexicans that make more than $1,000 a month. I know that a lot of Mexicans, in fact, the majority of Mexicans make under $1,000 a month. But guess what? There's a lot of Mexicans, and this keeps increasing every single day. There's a lot of Mexicans that are making a lot more than 1,000. In fact, they're making thousands of US dollars a month. And this piggybacks off of, what we've talked about multiple times here on the channel as to the strong Mexican economy, the strong growing peso, the strong Mexican economical influence that is, basically starting to really take over the world. Now, again, let's not forget, Mexico has always been a pretty strong economic powerhouse, but now they're really, really becoming an economic powerhouse. And so, therefore, everyone out there is also moving up with the tide. Even though most Mexicans still only make under $1,000 a month. In fact, a lot of them still only make around 500 US dollars a month. The reality is that more and more each and every day, more Mexicans are starting to make over 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and so on and so forth, okay? In fact, some Mexicans are getting so rich that now they are leaving Mexico and now they are the ones that are gentrifying certain areas of the world like Spain. which is pretty funny. You know, right now there's a lot of people in Spain complaining about, you know, all these Mexicans that are coming out to Spain and they're pricing out the actual Spanish that are living here. So it's like a reverse colonialism, all right? Again, I find it all very hilarious and very funny. But with that said, again, if most Mexicans still only make around $500 a month, or on the higher end, you know, middle class, you know, 1,000 or even 1,500 a month, okay, and they can live pretty comfortably. Obviously, the less you make, the less comfortable you're going to be. But the point I'm making is that most Mexicans can survive, all right, very, very well on around $1,000 a month. Well, then what is your excuse for not being able to survive or make it out here in Mexico on that same amount of money? So again, I recently made a cost of living video on this channel, and you know, again, I get a lot of people out there in the comments that basically they reinforce exactly what I was saying, that they themselves, as a foreigner living out here in Mexico, they spend under 1,500 or 1,000 a month. But there are so many Americans out there that basically keep complaining about how Mexico is just getting so expensive that it's pricing them out.
How, Sway?
Again, I don't know where they're living or what kind of lifestyle they lead, but the reality is that no, you know, Mexicans are not being priced out, you know, to that extent. So why are you being priced out? You know, what's going on here? So that's the reality of it. Again, I know this is a very complicated issue. This is why I've made specific videos, complete videos talking about gentrification and talking about this particular topic. So I'm not going to waste too much time on it here. But the reality is that most Mexicans can live on around $1,000 US. So what is your excuse for not being able to also live on that amount of money? Another amazing thing about Mexico is the fact that it has the largest pyramid on Earth. Yeah, you heard me right. The largest pyramid on Earth is actually located in Puebla. It is not located in Egypt. A lot of people out there think that, again, the great pyramids of Egypt are the only pyramids and the biggest pyramids. But the reality is that there are pyramids all over the world, and there are many, many pyramids in the Americas and a lot of pyramids in Mexico. Again, the biggest pyramid is in Puebla. So that's pretty cool. That's really interesting. In fact, you know, it reminds me of a joke that I heard once, and I never forget it because I always find it very funny, is that everyone is always questioning who built the pyramids in Egypt. You know, was it the aliens or was it ancient technology or whatever it is, right? But no one ever questions who built the pyramids in Mexico. Bruh. It was Mexicans. Again, that's the running joke, okay? I know, if you gotta repeat the punchline, that's not really a funny joke. But no, the reality is that, again, the Mexicans built the pyramids, all right? And there's a lot of documented evidence, you know, that shows exactly, you know, who built them, when they built them, and so on and so forth, okay? So, and not just the largest pyramid, but the fact that there's a whole culture and no one ever questions who actually built the pyramids out here. So again, that was also really, really cool. I think a lot of people out there do not even know that Mexico has pyramids to begin with. So not only do they have pyramids out here, but they got whole cities, all right, that were, you know, abandoned or taken over, whatever it is, but throughout the Americas, but definitely in Mexico. In fact, out here where I live in Mérida, Yucatan, this is basically kind of like the capital of, you know, Mayan ruins. So if you want to go see Mayan ruins, well, you come out here to Mérida, and from here you basically, you know, go around the whole region to go see all of the amazing archaeological finds that people have found throughout history. In fact, an extra fun fact, the original Indiana Jones actually came out from this region, you know, the region where I live, which is Mérida, Yucatan. In fact, he lived in this city. So the guy in which the Indiana Jones books, movies were based off of was actually a real guy that really existed, and he came out here a long, long time ago, and he started to cut through the jungle and started to, you know, uncover a lot of these things that, well, now we take for granted because they're basically uncovered all over the place. So Yeah, the Indiana Jones actually existed. He lived out here, and there's a lot of pyramids out here. There's a lot of history out here. In fact, there's so much to talk about on this one subject that, well, I don't have enough time here to cover it all. But yeah, that's a pretty cool fun fact. The fact that Mexico has the largest pyramid on Earth. Another really cool fun fact about Mexico is the fact that there are so many foods that we as humans love and enjoy on a daily basis that originated from Mexico. Here is just a short list of these ingredients, these foods that most of us take for granted and we eat all around the world. So for example, we got corn. Again, the basic staple of Mexican food and the basic staple of a lot of food in the world these days. But anyways, corn comes from Mexico. Turkey comes from Mexico. Beans, chia, avocados, tomatoes, chocolate, vanilla, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, squash, cactuses, chili peppers, and most importantly, agave. Agave is the plant from where tequila, the national drink of Mexico, is created, and mezcal. Okay, so all of these things originated from here. So think about it. If it wasn't for the discovery of tomatoes in Mexico, well, we wouldn't have, any kind of Sicilian cuisine or any kind of Italian cuisine when it comes to tomatoes, all right? If it wasn't for the discovery of avocados out here, you wouldn't be enjoying your avocado toast. Bruh. If it wasn't for the chilies and the peppers that were discovered here, well, a lot of Thai cuisine, a lot of Asian cuisine, they wouldn't have that spice that comes from the chili peppers that were found out here in Mexico. Chocolate, vanilla, some of the most delicious and basic ingredients, especially when we're making sweets. But long story short, these important foods that were discovered out here have influenced the food culture of many countries around the world. Not only were they influenced way back when they were discovered and exported to the rest of the world, but they are still a major part of the culinary foundation of many countries and many cuisines around the world. Again, to me, it's one of the most important things about Mexico is its food. Again, it's not just the discovery and exportation of these things around the world, but also the actual food itself. Mexican cuisine is not just tacos and burritos, all right? In fact, Mexican cuisine is just as diverse and more diverse, all right, than many countries out there around the world. And so most people out there, they just think that Mexican cuisine is what you're going to find at Taco Bell until you actually come out to Mexico and then you see, oh, wait a minute, none of this that I'm eating out here in Mexico resembles anything that I've ever had ever. In fact, Mexican food and cuisine is so important that it is considered by the UNESCO Foundation as one of the most important cuisines in the world. Again, it is a major influence on other cultures and culinary cuisine around the world. And the last thing about Mexico that you probably didn't know about is the fact that Mexico's economy, in fact, a good 70% of Mexico's economy belongs to the informal markets. Meaning that, they're not out there paying taxes or out there, with these licenses and permits and all this other stuff in order to function in the economy. In fact, most of the people that function in Mexico's economy, they don't report anything to any government entity. So right now, as of making of this video, Mexico is one of the richest countries in the world. Again, I don't know the exact number at the moment, but I think like the 11th most strongest economy in the world, okay? And that is, again, including the fact that most of the economy is not even counted in the official numbers. So if one were to actually count all of the numbers, count every single person that functions in the Mexican economy would be a lot stronger than what the numbers say. So again, there are many reasons why most Mexicans function in the informal economy, all right? But because of that, that allows most Mexicans to have so much more freedom. They don't have to pay taxes. They don't have to get all these, permits and paperwork and follow these rules and regulations and all this other stuff. But again, I've talked about this more in depth in other videos, okay? When we talk about more in depth about, business and how you can start your own business or conduct business out here in Mexico and so on and so forth. But again, the reality is that most of the Mexican economy belongs to the informal economy. That's why Mexico is also a very cash-heavy, cash-friendly country. Yes, you can pay with your credit card and your debit card or whatever it is out here, but the reality is that most people, okay, prefer cash. Okay, in fact, most places are cash only. So it's a cash economy. It is an informal economy. It is not connected nor centralized with the actual government. And so therefore, when a lot of economists or academics or whatever, talk about Mexico, they never really are able to count, the majority of Mexicans that are part of the economy because, well, they're not necessarily participating in that structure. So the formal economy would be things like corporate entities, regular jobs where you would have to pay your taxes and so on and so forth. Again, most Mexicans are entrepreneurs, business people, so on and so forth. And they function in this separate economy from the actual economy. All right. So if one were combine both economies together, Mexico would probably be in the top 5 strongest economies in the world. But because of them not being able to count the majority of people that do just day-to-day things, again, many people out there in many facets of the economy, such as, let's say a mechanic or a doctor or an artist or whatever it is, well, they're not, declaring how much they're actually making to the government, okay? And so since they're not declaring what they're making to the government, well, they're not paying taxes on that. And since they're not declaring it and it's not in the books, well, it doesn't exist, okay? And I could go on. But long story short, I'm sure most of you guys can understand what I mean by formal economy and informal economy, all right? But the reality is that, Mexico has a thriving economy that is just growing more and more each and every day. And this is why this is the place to be these days and where most people want to come. And they want to live out here and they want to start a new life out here. And the new American dream is actually taking place in countries like Mexico. Because of this lack of oversight, rules and regulations, taxes, and I could go on, all this red tape that basically hinders the small businessman, the small business person. And so, well, with all that being said, I think it's time to wrap it up. I think I've made a long enough episode already. I really, really hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. For all you new viewers out there, welcome. For all you old viewers out there, thanks again for watching. Thanks again for hanging out here. Again, I want to give a big special thanks to all my contributors, all my members, whether you're a member on Patreon or a member on YouTube or a member on anywhere. Again, shout out to all of you. I really appreciate all of you out there that contribute to the show. You guys are the real heroes out there. And I don't mean contributing money. You guys are extra special. I'm just talking about everyone else out there that contributes, watching the complete video. You guys might be watching an ad or two. You guys might be out there in the comments section leaving your own 2 cents or helping answer questions or comments that other people might have out there. At the end of the day, you already know we are building a community here of like-minded individuals, and we're all just trying to help each other, and we're just trying to make this whole transition of moving to Mexico as easy as possible, because again, it is a very, very daunting experience, and I'm just out here trying to help you guys and trying to build this community so that we can all help each other. So with all that being said, guys, you already know the deal. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to please like, please subscribe, please share, please hit the bell icon. But more importantly than anything else, please stay awesome. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye, guys.